parents said. "This trip isn't about you." And that was the last sentence they ever said to me with certainty, because a few hours later, they stood red-faced and helpless at a 5-star restaurant while the waiter quietly informed them their card had been declined. My mother blinked twice, looked at the server like he'd spoken in another language, then turned sharply toward me. I didn't react. I simply sipped my water, eyes steady. She didn't know it yet, but I had frozen the account, not just the card, the entire pattern, the years of manipulation, the endless guilt. I had stopped everything with one tap on my phone, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt no shame, only clarity. That moment was never about money. It was about power, and I had just taken mine back. I'm Emma Chamberlain, 28 years old, born and raised in Sacramento, California. I live in Denver now, in a condo I bought myself, with a front porch that gets just enough morning sun for plants and silence. I make a living through a mix of media and e-commerce, but before any of that, I was a daughter trying to make everyone happy. My parents, Trish and Kevin, divorced when I was 14, and the only thing they agreed on was that I should never be a burden. They said it like a compliment. "You've always been so independent, Em." But what they really meant was that I had learned to clean up their messes without being asked. At 15, I was making grocery runs alone because Mom forgot. At 16, I was tutoring neighborhood kids to cover my own school supplies. At 17, I sold thrifted clothes online so I wouldn't have to ask Dad for money for college applications. I thought this was normal. I thought I was strong. But strength without boundaries becomes servitude. And I didn't see that until much later. College was my first breath of space. I went to school in Arizona, got through it without parental support, and worked 2 jobs to keep my scholarship. By 22, I was building an online brand, making just enough to support myself and still send birthday gifts home. By 25, I was making real money, not flashy, not influencer rich, but stable, responsible, and that's when the requests began to grow. My dad's car broke down. My mom's new husband was out of work. "It's just temporary," they both said. Months apart, I covered a few bills, a medical copay, a plane ticket. Then it became expected. Family dinners turned into check-ins on my bank account. If I hesitated, I was reminded of how much they'd sacrificed for me. A gymnastics class I took for one summer, a trip to Disneyland when I was 8. My mother once said, dead serious, that my father deserved gratitude forever because he didn't leave completely. I nodded, because I didn't know how to say no without guilt, and guilt was my currency. It bought me peace, or so I thought. 2 months ago, my mother called with an idea, a family reset. She called it a vacation in Maui. Just us, she promised, a chance to reconnect. We'll cover the little things. Just bring yourself. I should have asked for details. I should have known better. But I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe there was still a version of my family that wanted me for more than my card number. I agreed. She sent me resort links the next day and asked which one I liked best. I chose the more modest of the options. 2 days later, I got an email confirming a booking under my name at the luxury resort, the most expensive one. 6 guests total. I texted her. Confused, she replied, "Oh, we thought it'd be nice to include Aunt Grace and Uncle Lon. You don't mind, do you? We're all family." That's when I noticed the credit card she used. Mine. The trip began with small humiliations. At the airport, I learned I was flying economy while everyone else had been upgraded to first class. "You don't mind." "Right," Mom said, without waiting for an answer. At the hotel, They checked into oceanfront suites. I was in a garden view room behind the spa. Each meal was charged to my account. Each excursion pre-booked with my name. I kept telling myself it wasn't the time to speak up, that if I just got through it, maybe we'd actually have the emotional moment I secretly longed for. But the moment never came, only the costs, financial, emotional, and invisible, until one morning, in a borrowed robe, my mother knocked on my door and said coldly, "We've booked a full spa day. I need your card. Don't be selfish. This trip isn't about you." I handed her the card without a word. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed, opened my banking app, and froze the account. The funny thing about silence is that it can feel like surrender, but sometimes it's strategy. I didn't plan to freeze the card. I planned to survive the trip, swallow the small insults, and maybe go home a little more disappointed than usual. That was the pattern. But something in my mother's tone that morning cracked the surface. The way she reached out her hand, demanded my card, and said without hesitation, "This trip isn't about you." Not even a smile, not even a fake please, just pure expectation, like I was the hotel concierge and not her daughter. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I handed her the card, then locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the banking app I had avoided checking since we landed. My heart beat steady as the numbers loaded. Then it dropped. Over $12,000 charged in less than 5 days. Spa packages, private van rentals, upgraded wine tastings, a snorkeling tour I wasn't even invited to. I sat still, looking at the number like it belonged to someone else, and then, without thinking too much, I clicked the button I had never touched before. Freeze card, confirm. 3 minutes later, the account was locked. And just like that, I wasn't the family ATM anymore. It was strange how quiet the room felt afterward, like I had shut off more than just access to money, like I had shut off the permission I'd given everyone to take from me just because I could give. I didn't tell them. I let the clock run. I waited for the moment that would inevitably come, and when it did, it was glorious in the most silent, controlled, painful way. At lunch that afternoon, we went to a white tablecloth restaurant with a sea view, the kind of place that makes you feel like a person worth something, even if you aren't. They ordered appetizers like they were on a game show, bottles of wine, extra sides, dessert menus before we'd even seen entrees. I said little. I watched. My dad asked for the most expensive bourbon on the menu. My mom bragged to Aunt Grace about the suite. I excused myself to the bathroom when I saw the check coming. I didn't want to miss it, but I didn't want to see it up close either. So I waited just outside the hallway, sipping water, pretending to scroll my phone. I heard my name, my mother's voice first, sharp, controlled. "What do you mean? Declined." The silence that followed was more delicious than dessert. A few chairs scraped the floor, forks paused, and I knew then that I had just shifted something bigger than a transaction. I had shifted the power dynamic of my entire family. It wasn't always like this. That's the part that still confuses me sometimes. There were years, early on, when things felt real, before the divorce, before the performative generosity, before I became a provider instead of a daughter. I remember my dad pushing me on the swings, my mom brushing my hair before school, but those moments got buried under layers of expectations, somewhere along the way. Their pride in my success mutated into entitlement. They never said thank you. They said things like, "You're so lucky you can help," or worse. That's what family does. What they meant was, that's what you do. For us, always. No matter how much it costs you, The first time they asked for money, I was 22. My dad had missed a mortgage payment and called me crying. I wired him $4,000 from my savings. He said he'd pay me back. He never did. The second time, my mom said her new husband had a minor surgery and the insurance didn't cover all of it. I paid again. By the time I was 26, I had covered 2 tax bills, 3 dental emergencies, and a replacement iPhone for my mother because she dropped hers during a yoga retreat in Palm Springs. She called it a spiritual accident. I called it Tuesday. I never pushed back because I thought saying no made me a bad daughter. Because they never screamed. They manipulated with silence, disappointment, and comparison. Allison took her parents on a cruise last year. My mom would say, "You know, she's not even as successful as you." My dad's favorite was, "We're not asking for much, just a little help. We raised you, didn't we?" It always ended with me reaching for my wallet and them acting like it was owed. But no one teaches you how to unlearn guilt. No one tells you that boundaries don't always feel good when you first set them. Sometimes they feel like betrayal, especially when you've been groomed to believe your worth is what you can give, not who you are. So when I froze the card, it wasn't just a financial decision. It was emotional, psychological. It was me choosing to protect the woman I'd become from the family that refused to see her as anything more than a resource. They didn't confront me right away. They stewed that night. My dad asked to have a word on the balcony. I followed him out. He lit a cigar like he was about to offer life advice. "We have a problem," he said. "Your mother's card was declined." The waiter looked like he was going to call security. I looked him straight in the eye. "I know." His brows furrowed. "Did something happen with your account?" I let the silence sit. "No," I said. "I just froze it. Temporarily." He looked like I'd slapped him. "Why would you do that?" I paused, then said it slowly. "Because no one asked me if I wanted to pay for this vacation." He didn't argue. He just walked back inside, and in that moment, I understood something I hadn't grasped in years. Power doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it just needs to stop saying yes. The next morning, the silence was loud. No one knocked on my door for breakfast. No one texted about plans. It was the first day since we landed in Maui that I wasn't treated like an unpaid tour guide. I made my own coffee in the room, stood by the small balcony facing a parking lot, and let the quiet sink in. It wasn't peace. It was a pause, like the air before a storm. I knew they were regrouping, rewiring their strategy, figuring out who would guilt me first. I didn't have to wait long. By noon, my mother found me by the pool, already in character, sunglasses on, a beach wrap thrown over her swimsuit, tone sweet but firm. She didn't sit down, just hovered. "Emma, can we talk for a second?" I nodded without looking up. She lowered her voice like it was a secret. "I don't know what's going on with your card, but it's causing a lot of confusion. You embarrassed us in front of everyone last night." I turned to her slowly. "Did you ask me before putting all those charges on my account?" Her lips pressed together, then parted again. "We assumed. We thought you wanted to treat the family. It's not like you can't afford it." That sentence, so simple, so dangerous. It echoed all the others she'd used over the years. "It's just a few hundred. It's not that big of a deal. You make more than any of us." The implication always the same. If you can pay, you should. Because family. I stood up. "You didn't ask. You didn't consult. You didn't include me in a single decision. You didn't even book me a seat in first class." She blinked. "You wanted first class." I didn't answer, because that wasn't the point. It had never been about seats or suites or spa packages. It was about being invisible until it was time to pay. It was about the way they saw me, not as a daughter, as a sponsor. By that afternoon, the narrative had shifted. I overheard Aunt Grace talking to one of the friends they brought along. "She's clearly going through something," she whispered. "Maybe a breakup or burnout." That would explain the overreaction. Overreaction. That word stung more than I expected. Isn't that always the play when you finally push back? They call it emotional instability. When you say no, they say you're being dramatic. When you protect yourself, they say you're punishing everyone. That night, I didn't go to dinner with them. I ordered room service, paid for it myself, watched a documentary, slept early. It was the most peaceful night I'd had in years. No expectations, no forced toasts, no fake laughter to cover a real ache. The next morning, I woke up with the sun and took a walk by myself. For the first time on this trip, I did something I wanted. I signed up for a traditional Hawaiian cultural demonstration, something I'd mentioned days ago that no one else was interested in. They wanted wine tastings. I wanted stories. When I returned, there was a note slipped under my door, my dad's handwriting. "Please meet me at the lobby bar at 4 p.m. Alone." I almost didn't go, but part of me wanted to see how he'd play it. He was already seated when I arrived. 2 drinks in, he gestured for me to sit. "Emma, listen, your mother and we didn't mean for things to go like this." He paused, waiting for sympathy. I stayed quiet. This trip was supposed to be about reconnecting, about celebrating your success. I raised an eyebrow. "By excluding me." He waved it off. "We thought we were doing something nice. You've always been so generous. We didn't think you'd mind." That word again. Didn't think or didn't care. Then he leaned in, lowered his voice. "Listen, since we're talking about finances, there's something I wanted to ask." I almost laughed. "Of course. We've been thinking of renovating the kitchen. Your mom wants new counters, some nicer appliances. You know how she is. We'd cover most of it. Just need a little help. 20 grand. I stared at him, not shocked, not even angry anymore, just tired. So that's what this trip was, a warm-up pitch. He looked offended. "No, this is about family." I stood up. "This is about access. And you just lost it." He didn't follow me, didn't shout, just sat there, as if he couldn't quite process that the faucet had finally been turned off. The next 2 days were quiet. They made plans without me. Good. I needed the space. I spent that time reclaiming the trip. Little by little, I walked the beaches alone, talked to locals, bought myself a dress from a small store instead of some overpriced boutique they had dragged me to earlier. I sat with myself. I grieved a version of family that never existed, and somehow, that grief made room for something else, something like relief. On the 3rd day, I saw Barbara, one of the friends my parents had invited, in the lobby. She looked uneasy. "Emma, can I speak to you for a moment?" I nodded. I didn't know. She began. "Judith told us you had insisted on paying for everything. She made it sound like this was your gift to the family. I wouldn't have come otherwise." I believed her. I saw the shame in her eyes. That's how it's always been. I said, "They rewrite the story before I can speak." Barbara swallowed. "I'm sorry. We'll be leaving early." That evening, 2 more couples checked out quietly. No drama, just suitcases and silence. My parents didn't say anything, but I saw the tension in their faces. Their perfect vacation was crumbling. Not because I sabotaged it, because I stopped funding it. And that's the part they never planned for. The day after the couples left, my mother finally broke the silence, not with an apology, not with reflection, but with a performance. She showed up at my door in full makeup, eyes glossy, voice trembling just enough to feel rehearsed. "Emma," she said, "how could you do this to us? We're stranded here. We can't even cover the hotel balance." She held up a printed bill like it was evidence of betrayal. I stood in the doorway and said nothing. "You embarrassed us in front of our friends. You humiliated your father." Her voice cracked again. "After everything we've done for you." I didn't flinch. I asked one simple question. "What exactly have you done for me?" That stunned her. She blinked like I had spoken a foreign language. "We raised you." "No," I said calmly. "You kept me alive. But raising someone means more than feeding them and reminding them of it for the rest of their life. It means modeling accountability. It means asking, not assuming. It means listening when someone says no." She didn't like that answer. Her face changed. The tears dried quickly. "You know what people are going to think when they hear this," she hissed, "that you left your aging parents stranded in Hawaii." I smiled slightly. "You're both in your 60s, and the only thing stranded here is the illusion that I'll always pay without question." I closed the door. That night, I wrote an email, a clear, business-like outline of what I was still willing to pay for and what I would not. I transferred enough money to cover the remainder of their room charges and 2 economy tickets back home. No more upgrades, no spa credits, no excursions, no bills racked up behind my back. Attached to the email was a PDF of the itemized resort charges, highlighted to show which ones were booked without my knowledge. I also added screenshots of the texts my mother had sent earlier, with that now famous line, "This trip isn't about you." I CC'd my dad. I hit send. And then I did something revolutionary. I turned off my phone and walked barefoot to the beach. It was quiet by the water, almost sacred. I sat alone, letting the tide kiss the sand around my ankles. No one was asking me to explain myself. No one needed a card swipe. No one expected anything. That kind of stillness feels foreign when you've been someone else's lifeline for too long. I stayed there for an hour, then returned to the resort, checked into a different wing, and gave the front desk instructions not to disclose my location to anyone. I wasn't hiding. I was healing, and I didn't owe anyone access to that process. The next day, I got a call from my cousin Brianna. "Hey, your mom called me," she said cautiously. "She said you abandoned them in Hawaii and froze your card like you were having some kind of breakdown." I almost laughed. "That's the version she's running with." "Yeah," Brianna admitted. "But then I saw your post." I had quietly uploaded a photo of the hotel bill and a caption that read, "Boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity." I hadn't tagged anyone. I didn't need to. The people who knew. Brianna sighed. "Honestly, I wish I had done what you did years ago. You're brave." That word hit different. Not rebellious, not dramatic. Brave. By the time I checked out of the hotel 2 days later, the staff knew me by name. One of the servers handed me a box of pastries wrapped in twine. "For your flight," she said kindly. "You're one of the most peaceful guests we've had all month." I thanked her and meant it. I had never felt peaceful during a vacation before, but this one, the second half at least, felt like my own. I had gone paddleboarding for the first time, sat through a full sunrise without checking my phone, and finished an entire book without interruption. No family tension, no guilt, just air. At the airport, I saw my parents in the distance. They didn't see me. My mother was arguing with a gate agent. My father was pacing behind her. I could tell from the energy that something wasn't going smoothly. I could have gone over, could have smoothed it out like I always did. But I didn't. I kept walking, found my gate, bought myself a coffee, sat down in a window seat and watched the planes roll by. On the flight, I started writing this story, not to shame anyone, not for revenge, but because I knew there were other people out there, sitting on the edge of their own boundary, afraid to act, afraid to say no, afraid to freeze the card. This story isn't about a vacation. It's about freedom. It's about what happens when you stop measuring your worth by how much you tolerate. It's about remembering that love without respect is just manipulation dressed up in nostalgia, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is leave the table, even if it's set with candles and dessert. You don't owe anyone endless access to your peace. 3 weeks after I got back from Hawaii, a card arrived in the mail, not a credit card, a folded white card with my name handwritten on the front. Inside, my father's handwriting sharp, deliberate, familiar. Emma, I'm proud of the woman you've become, not because of what you've given us, but because of how you finally stood up for yourself. Happy early birthday. Love, Dad. There was no check, no manipulation, no request, just words. And yet, that meant more than anything he'd handed me in years. I read it twice, then set it down, unsure how to feel. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't an excuse either. It was a beginning, small, uncertain, but real. My mother, on the other hand, doubled down. Weekly texts comparing me to other people's daughters, guilt served cold, layered in questions. Have you seen how Brian's daughter just bought them a cruise? Or, we miss you. Your aunt says it's a shame how distant you've become. I didn't bite. I responded with simple things like, that's nice, or hope you're doing okay. I stopped defending my choices. I stopped justifying my boundaries. And slowly, she stopped texting as often. The silences became longer, but they felt cleaner. I started therapy the following month. The first session felt strange, like I was narrating someone else's story. I told Dr. Fields about the vacation, the card, the confrontation, the years of quiet debt. She nodded without interrupting. When I finished, she said one thing. What you did wasn't cruel. It was overdue. I don't remember the last time I felt so validated by so few words. We talked about financial trauma, about emotional parentification, about the ways women are taught to equate being good with being useful. Week by week, I started unlearning habits I hadn't even noticed, like apologizing for being unavailable, like over-explaining every no, like feeling guilty for spending money on myself when no one else was benefiting from it. Around the same time, I implemented something I called the giving budget, one account, a fixed number per month. Once that money was gone, any request from friends, family, even charity had to wait. It sounds cold on paper, but it gave me structure. It gave me peace. It gave me a way to be generous without collapsing. And surprisingly, the people who truly loved me respected that boundary. The ones who didn't just disappeared. Professionally, things shifted too, without the constant background stress of carrying everyone else's emergencies. I started focusing more clearly. I pitched a new content strategy to a client and landed a long-term retainer deal. I began saying no to partnerships that didn't align. I took weekends off, for the first time in 2 years, without feeling guilty. And when I launched a small course on financial boundaries, over 200 people signed up in 48 hours. Turns out, I wasn't the only one suffocating in silence. Then came a message from my sister. We hadn't spoken much in years. She had left home at 19 and rarely looked back. I heard what happened in Hawaii. She wrote, Mom called me in tears, but I've also seen how much lighter you look lately. Just wanted to say, I get it. That last sentence made me pause. Maybe we hadn't been estranged. Maybe we'd just both been surviving in our own ways. I replied, Thank you, if you ever want to talk about it. I'm here. She responded, I will. When I'm ready. That was enough. Months passed. I started sleeping better. My budget was no longer a battlefield. My calendar wasn't packed with obligations that drained me. I bought a used piano and started relearning the keys, something I hadn't done since middle school. I threw a small dinner for 5 friends and laughed so hard I forgot to check my phone all night. And one afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a photo of me at 11 wide-eyed, in a too big backpack, holding a homemade sign that read, First Day of 6th Grade. I looked at that girl and whispered, You're safe now. You don't have to earn love anymore. Boundaries aren't walls. They're filters. They don't push people away. They reveal who's willing to meet you where you stand. And standing, for me, used to feel like a risk. Now it feels like a right. One evening, I bumped into a former colleague at a bookstore. She'd heard rumors about the Hawaii trip and tiptoed around the subject until she finally asked, Was it really that bad? I smiled. It was worse than people think, but it was also the best thing that ever happened to me. She blinked. Really, yeah, I said, because it finally gave me permission to choose myself. She nodded slowly. I wish I could do that. You can. I said, the moment you stop apologizing for needing respect, your life changes, and that's what Hawaii gave me. Not peace, not forgiveness, but clarity. And from that clarity came power, not the kind that dominates, the kind that frees, one Saturday morning. I was sitting at a cafe downtown, sipping a latte and making notes for an upcoming video campaign, when a familiar voice called my name, Emma. I looked up. It was Gerald, one of the men my parents had brought on the Hawaii trip. He looked out of place here, holding a plain black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and wearing a look that said this wasn't a planned encounter. Can I join you for a moment? He asked. I nodded, motioning to the seat across from me. He sat down with a hesitant smile. I've been meaning to run into you, he began, not quite making eye contact. I wanted to apologize about the trip, about everything, really. I let the silence hang long enough for him to feel it. Then I said, What changed? He stirred his coffee with the wooden stick, but didn't add anything to it. Barbara and we've been talking. That vacation felt off from the beginning, but your parents insisted you were thrilled to host. When things unraveled, it was obvious we'd been misled. I nodded. You weren't the first. You probably won't be the last. He looked up then, eyes heavier than I remembered. We also didn't ask questions. We accepted luxury without wondering who paid. That's on us. His honesty was unexpected, and honestly, it softened something in me. I didn't want an apology for sympathy. I wanted accountability. And there it was, quiet and uncomfortable but real. You weren't the problem, I said, but you were part of the pattern. He nodded. That's why I wanted to say something. Also, your parents, they're struggling. There's tension between them now. Your dad started asking questions. Your mom's not used to being questioned. That made me pause. Part of me felt guilty. Another part felt indifferent. But the largest part felt something new, detached clarity. Their dynamic wasn't my responsibility. I hadn't broken their marriage. I had just stopped subsidizing it after Gerald left. I walked aimlessly for a while, letting the city noise wash over me like background music. I thought about what it means to be the person everyone leans on, the go-to, the solid one. People praise your reliability, your strength, your generosity. What they don't see is the exhaustion, the silent erasure of your needs, the invisible cost of being the one who can handle it that afternoon. I booked something I'd been putting off for years, a solo trip to Europe. Nothing flashy, Just me, a carry-on, a rail pass, and a loose itinerary of cities I'd always dreamed of but never prioritized. Lisbon, Vienna, Florence. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even my therapist. I just let the ideas sit in my chest like a secret only I got to be excited about. In the weeks leading up to the trip, I created a new system in my life. I called it emotional budgeting, same idea as financial limits, but for energy, every day. I checked in with myself like I would with a bank account. How much could I give today? What was draining me? What was adding value? And most importantly, where was I overspending emotionally, mentally, relationally? To my surprise, this one shift changed everything. I stopped replying to guilt-driven messages. I started canceling meetings when I didn't have the bandwidth. I paused content projects that no longer aligned with what I valued. And something unexpected happened. My creativity came back. So did my sleep. So did my appetite for stillness. Then, one night before my trip, I got a call from a podcast producer I had met a year earlier at a speaking event. "Emma," she said, "we're putting together a limited series on financial trauma and family expectations. I remembered your Hawaii story. Would you be willing to share it for a moment?" I hesitated, not because I was afraid to tell it, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to make it content. Then she added, "You don't have to come on as a guest. You could co-host, build the structure with us, shape it from the inside. That changed everything." I said yes, because stories like mine don't just need to be told. They need to be named, framed, understood. I didn't freeze the card just to save my bank account. I did it to unfreeze my voice, my sense of worth, my capacity to believe I was allowed to take up space without being the solution to everyone else's crisis. And if my story could give someone else permission to do the same, it was worth putting into the world. As I packed for Europe, I laid out every item carefully, not just clothes, but freedom, not just passports, but permission. I wasn't running away. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply going because I could, because I wanted to. Because I no longer needed anyone's approval to design a life that actually felt like mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't escaping anything. I was returning to myself. The first morning I woke up in Lisbon, I didn't check my email. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't plan the day by anyone else's schedule. I simply opened the windows of my rented apartment, felt the unfamiliar breeze across my skin, and made breakfast barefoot in silence. There was something liberating about boiling water without urgency, about slicing fruit without glancing at the clock. My body felt slower, less braced, like it was finally safe to relax without being on call for someone else's needs. I spent the day walking without purpose, getting lost on purpose, letting myself be a tourist without performance, no makeup, no outfit content, no updates, just me and cobblestone streets and the sensation of existing without obligation. The city didn't know me as the responsible one. No one here expected me to show up with a solution or a spreadsheet, and in that freedom, I found parts of myself I had filed away for years in Vienna. I visited an art museum and spent over an hour in one room, staring at a painting that reminded me of something I couldn't name. In Florence, I took a cooking class with strangers and made a mess of the pasta dough without apologizing. I laughed when it stuck to my hands. I let someone else clean the counter. That felt revolutionary. Each city offered something I hadn't realized I missed: space, stillness, the absence of guilt. And in that space, I began writing not for a client, not for content, but for me. I wrote pages about how boundaries don't always look like walls. Sometimes they look like choosing yourself quietly. Sometimes they look like changing your number. Sometimes they're just not replying. One evening, I sat by the Arno River watching people gather, some laughing, some silent, and it hit me that healing doesn't come with fanfare. It arrives softly, when no one is looking, when you stop looking for applause and start listening for your own breath. That night, I checked my phone for the first time in days. There were unread texts from my mother, each one more passive-aggressive than the last. Hope you're okay. We haven't heard from you. I assume you're still mad. And finally, it's been 3 months. Emma, families move on. That one sat differently. Not because it hurt, but because of how predictable it was. That was always her move. Reframe the narrative. Make me the one who abandoned, the one who distanced, the one who created tension, as if my refusal to enable the dysfunction was the root problem. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the text to my therapist with one sentence, "She still doesn't get it." And then I put the phone down and walked to dinner alone. No makeup, no guilt, just presence. On my second to last day in Florence, I received a message from Allison, the producer I had been working with on the podcast. She said the first episode had gone live, the one where I introduced the story in my own words, not as a victim, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. She sent the analytics. Thousands of listens in under 24 hours. Hundreds of messages from people who said they finally felt seen. One said, "I canceled a flight home after hearing this." Another said, "I called my bank and took my parents off my account." I sat with those messages longer than I expected, tears threatening but not falling. It wasn't about impact or validation. It was about resonance, about knowing I hadn't suffered for nothing, about realizing that survival, when shared with honesty, becomes a map for someone else. When I landed back in the States, my apartment felt different, not bigger, just clearer. Like the silence now had shape, I watered my plants, unpacked slowly, opened mail, and in one of the envelopes was another card from my father. No money, no plea, just a note. "I've started therapy." It said, "I don't know where this will go, but I thought you should know." I sat with that longer than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was unexpected. A small crack in a wall I had long stopped trying to climb. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Sometimes the healthiest choice is staying quiet when you used to rush to fix. Over the next few weeks, I rebuilt my life in small, intentional ways. I automated my savings. I set up a giving fund with a strict monthly cap. I created a list of people who could access me when I'm overwhelmed, and it was shorter than I thought. I printed out a quote and taped it near my desk. "You're not difficult. You're just no longer easy to manipulate." It reminded me of Hawaii, of the card, of that final restaurant table, and it made me smile, not with bitterness, with clarity, because the goal was never to punish anyone. The goal was to stop punishing myself, and I had finally done that. 6 months after Hawaii, I hosted my first dinner in a long time, not for work, not to impress anyone, just because I wanted to. 6 people sat around the table in my apartment, real people who never asked me for anything but showed up when it counted. Stephanie brought a bottle of wine and made us laugh so hard we forgot to check our phones. My neighbor Rebecca brought dessert she baked from scratch. My colleague Justin helped with dishes even though no one asked. Allison flew in from Seattle just to sit across from me and eat in peace like sisters who had survived something unspoken. As we passed plates and clinked glasses, someone raised a toast. "To Emma," Stephanie said, who reminded us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. I laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from a healed place. Not because everything was perfect, but because the version of me who once apologized for having needs was gone. The room didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. And I realized something as we ate and talked and existed without obligation. Family isn't who raises their voice when you set a boundary. It's who lowers theirs to understand it. That night, after everyone left and the apartment was filled only with quiet and the faint scent of lemon and rosemary, I stood at my window and thought about the girl who had boarded that flight to Maui, hoping for approval. The one who accepted an economy seat while paying for first class. The one who watched her bank account drain while pretending to be grateful for the scraps of attention she got in return. I thought about how many people live like that every day. In families or friendships or marriages where love is conditional and respect is currency. And I knew then that what I had done freezing the card, walking away, drawing a line wasn't rebellion. It was repair, quiet, necessary repair, the kind of repair that takes longer because it doesn't come with applause. A few days later, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years, an old family friend who'd heard the version my mother had spread, that I had melted down in Hawaii, that I walked out on the family, that I had refused to pay my share. I smiled politely and let her finish before offering my version. Just the facts. No rage, no dramatics, just numbers, dates, receipts, a total, a pause. Then I said, I paid almost $15,000 for a vacation where I was called selfish for wanting to attend a cultural demonstration instead of funding a private wine tour for people I didn't invite. She blinked. I didn't fill the silence. I let the weight of reality sit between us. Oh, she said eventually. I didn't know that part. Most people don't. Because when someone starts standing up for themselves, the people who benefited from their silence start rewriting the story. That's what my parents had done, and in the past, I would have tried to clean that up, but not anymore. I had learned that truth doesn't need a defense team. It just needs space. In therapy. We talked about what came next. My therapist, calm and clear as always, asked, do you want a relationship with them now, or do you just feel like you should? It was a harder question than I expected, because even after everything, some part of me still craved what I never had, a version of family that knew how to love without conditions. But craving isn't the same as needing, and memory isn't the same as obligation. I told her I didn't know yet, that I wanted to live in the pause without rushing to define it, that maybe the healthiest thing I could do was not decide. And she said, that's also a choice. I started applying that logic to everything when invitations came in. I asked myself if they came with pressure or peace. When texts arrived late at night, I asked whether replying would drain or nourish me. When opportunities looked shiny, I asked whether they aligned with my values or just my ego. And slowly, my life began to reshape itself, not dramatically, not in headlines, but like a house being rebuilt after a storm, quiet, solid, different. I started receiving messages from strangers who had heard the podcast. They weren't asking for advice. They were thanking me for saying out loud what they'd been whispering to themselves for years. I froze my card too. I finally said no to my brother. I opened a separate account after my husband kept draining mine. I saved every message, not to remind myself of impact, but to remember that courage is contagious, that one person's boundary can become another person's permission, that clarity, when spoken, ripples. And that's what Hawaii gave me, not trauma, not loss, but clarity. And from that clarity came peace, not the soft, fragile kind, the grounded kind, the kind that says, I am allowed to exist in this world without being consumed by everyone else's expectations. I am allowed to love people and still say no. I am allowed to show up for myself first. That's not betrayal. That's the beginning of freedom. The following week, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting unmistakably hers, sharp and deliberate as always. I stared at it for a while before opening it, half expecting a trap disguised as sentiment. Inside was 3 pages of elegant cursive part apology, part justification, part subtle manipulation masked as reflection. She wrote about how hard it was to be a parent, how misunderstood she felt, how families sometimes get off track. She never said the words, "I'm sorry," outright. Instead, she wrote things like, "If I made you feel used, that was never my intention, and I hope one day you'll understand what we were trying to do for you." There it was again, the same old pattern, the emotional sleight of hand. It sounded generous, but it still centered their narrative, their needs, their confusion about why I was no longer willing to carry it all. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in a drawer I rarely open, and didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because I was done performing closure for people who had no interest in mutual understanding. That day, I walked to the small bookstore around the corner and bought myself a new journal. On the first page, I wrote one sentence: "I don't owe peace to people who created the chaos." It was a sentence I had once been too afraid to say out loud. Now, it felt like armor. In the weeks that followed, I found myself building a new rhythm, one that didn't orbit around guilt. I started making Sundays a no-contact day, no work calls, no family conversations, just music, errands, and silence. I restructured my finances again, this time not out of fear, but out of foresight. I reviewed every recurring charge, every shared account, every forgotten auto pay. I closed what no longer served me. I opened what gave me room to grow. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't post about it. I just lived it. And the longer I lived it, the more distance I felt from the version of me who used to apologize for existing. I used to think strength looked like endurance. Now I think it looks like discernment, choosing what deserves your energy, protecting your peace like it's a precious currency, and refusing to fund relationships that only withdraw. One afternoon, I ran into a woman named Layla at a professional workshop. She had heard my name through the podcast and came up to me during the break. "Your episode changed everything," she said quietly. "I closed a joint account with my parents after 10 years. I was so scared they'd cut me off emotionally, but instead, they actually started treating me like an adult, like I had limits." I looked at her and smiled, not the public smile, the real one, because I knew how heavy that first no can be, how much it costs to walk away from patterns that once felt like love. But I also knew the freedom that follows, the sleep that finally returns, the clarity that starts to build when no one is draining you just because they can. After the event, I went home and took a long shower, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to wash off the weight of all those years I spent trying to earn love through self-erasure. I made tea. I turned off my phone. I read until I fell asleep with the book still open. And sometime around midnight, I woke up and thought about that restaurant in Hawaii, the one where it all broke open. I remembered the look on my mother's face when the waiter told her the card had been declined. I remembered the silence that followed, the 7 sets of eyes staring at me like I had set fire to the table. I remembered my calm, not smugness, not revenge, just stillness. The power of knowing that I had done something I never thought I could, that I had finally chosen myself, not out of spite, but out of necessity. And I realized then that we don't always need a dramatic ending to heal. Sometimes we just need one clean break, one bold sentence, one action that says, "This is where I end and you begin." That was what freezing the card had done for me, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually. It was the line I drew not to hurt them, but to stop hurting myself. It didn't fix everything, but it changed everything. And now, months later, with the sun pouring into my kitchen and the scent of coffee filling the room, I finally feel something I used to think was impossible, safe, not because the past disappeared, but because I no longer carry it like a debt I have to keep repaying. 3 months after Hawaii, I saw my parents again at a family wedding in Santa Barbara. I didn't go to make a point. I went because I no longer needed to avoid them to feel safe. I arrived alone, in a green satin dress I had bought for myself 2 weeks earlier without asking anyone's opinion. It was the same color my mother once told me made me look tired. I wore it on purpose, not to provoke her, but to remind myself that I no longer filtered my choices through her voice. When I stepped into the courtyard, the air smelled like eucalyptus and champagne. Laughter bubbled from every corner. The music floated over the hedges, elegant and forgettable. I spotted them from across the lawn. My mother's hand rested lightly on my father's arm, like a performance. He was listening to someone else talk, but his eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on me. His face didn't harden. It softened. For just a second, I nodded politely and kept walking. Throughout the ceremony and reception, we didn't speak. I didn't sit near them. I didn't offer an opening, not out of anger, but because I had nothing left to negotiate. I existed beside them now, not beneath them, and that alone felt like a revolution. Later, just before sunset, I was standing by the railing overlooking the ocean when my father approached. He didn't speak right away. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, staring at the horizon. Then he said, quietly, "I read your article." I turned my head slightly. The one about financial boundaries, he nodded. "I didn't know that's how it felt for you." I didn't answer. I waited. He shifted his weight, eyes still on the sea. "Your mother still doesn't understand, but I think I'm starting to." I took a breath. It wasn't about the money. He nodded again. "I know." We stood in silence, and for the first time in years, it wasn't heavy. It was mutual, honest. He didn't ask to fix anything. He didn't offer a retroactive apology. He just stood there, finally willing to sit in the discomfort, and that alone felt like progress. When he left, I stayed a few minutes longer, thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who planned the trip, the one who paid the bill, the one who thought love could be earned through sacrifice. I barely recognized her now, back home. My apartment welcomed me with soft light and quiet plants still thriving in their corners. I made tea, answered only the emails that didn't drain me, and opened my journal to a blank page. I wrote one sentence: "I no longer build bridges for people who set fire to the last one." That sentence stayed with me. I carried it into meetings, into casual conversations, into choices about what I allowed into my calendar, my energy, and my finances. A few days later, I posted a short reel. No music, just me walking by the ocean. The caption simple: "This trip isn't about you. It never was." The comments rolled in fast. Some were from strangers, some from people I hadn't heard from in years. One said, "I finally said no to hosting Thanksgiving." Another said, "I opened my own account today." A third said, "Thank you. I didn't know I was allowed to stop performing for people who love me conditionally." And I realized again that stories don't just heal when you tell them. They ripple. They become other people's courage, other people's blueprint. Weeks passed, seasons shifted, and one morning, as I brewed coffee and listened to birds outside my window, I realized I hadn't thought about the Hawaii trip in days. It no longer haunted me. It no longer defined me. It had become what it was always meant to be, a turning point, a clean edge, the moment I stopped asking for space and started taking it. The moment I remembered that choosing myself wasn't abandonment, it was alignment, the beginning of a life I didn't have to shrink inside of, the start of a version of me that no longer needed to be rescued. As I closed my journal and reached for my phone, a new notification came in from the podcast platform. Our series had hit 500,000 downloads. I smiled, not because of the number, but because every one of those listens meant someone else was waking up to the same truth. That love without respect isn't love. That peace built on guilt isn't peace. That you don't have to keep bleeding to prove you care. And most of all, that it's never too late to redraw the lines, to unlearn the roles you were cast in, to rewrite the version of your story where you were never allowed to want more. Because if a girl like me, raised to say yes, taught to overfunction, trained to disappear for harmony, could stand up at that dinner table and say enough, then maybe someone watching can too. So now I'll ask you, the same way I once asked myself, what would your life look like if you stopped paying for the comfort of others with the cost of yourself?